I am so excited that Dr. Willie Parker, or can I call you Dr. Willie?
Absolutely.
Thank you. That Dr. Willie is here with us in Tulsa today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you're traveling a lot these days to be with us at what feels like a really unique, powerful moment in history.
Reverend Barbara, as always, the pleasure is mine to be here.
We've had some amazing conversations just in the last 12 to 18 hours, working with this metaphor, playing with this metaphor of birth. Pastor Smith and Reverend Marlin set us up perfectly last week talking about the birth of a new freedom and the need for the birth of a new freedom in our country today, with this awakening awareness within the majority of white people that this land hasn't been free for everyone. So where would you say we are in this? Birth is a process, right? There has to be conception and gestation, and there are stages of labor, and not all births are successful. Where would you say we are in that process today?
Well, again, let me express my gratitude and excitement about being here with you in what has become a long-standing, mutually fruitful relationship. And also, not just because of my tremendous respect for your ministry here, but also for our shared heritage around birth and what that's meant to us career-wise. You as a midwife and me trained as an ObGyn, a medical doctor. And when we think about in this moment where we are, where lots is happening, both above, in front of the scenes and behind the scenes, just like birth, when things are happening, there are lots of rapid dynamic changes that are occurring. Some that we can see, and some based on what we know about birth, we know that the things that are happening that we can't see.
So much.
And so with birth being a very old analogy for new beginnings and new possibilities, I'm excited that we're going to try and explore in this metaphor what's happening right now in this moment that's very, like birth, very pregnant with possibilities, every pun intended, but it's also very fraught with peril, as we know. As you shared with me when we were talking, getting ready, the possibility of death is always present in the course of the birthing process. You know, in our religious tradition, me, as somebody with a Christian understanding, one of the most essential metaphors about new life is you must be born again. The words that supposedly Jesus said to Nicodemus. But also in our national understanding and ideology, when you look at some of the most famous declarations like President Abraham Lincoln's opening of the Gettysburg Address 77 years ago, our founding fathers brought forth on this continent, brought forth as a metaphor of birth, bringing forth a new nation conceived in liberty. The possibilities of new possibilities as birth attendants, we know, start with conception. And so in this moment, and in the context of this analogy, you know, when we look at our national history and our documents, our nation was conceived with noble aspirations, you know, but what we've ended up with appears to be greatly different from what our documents say our nation was conceived in the concept of.
Neither one of us were included, for example,
Exactly.
in those freedoms at the beginning, right?
Because the functional limitations now that were not explicit, but that were given, that became clear when we were included by the process of amendment, like racism, sexism, anti-immigrant status, or at least xenophobia, patriarchy. These were the things that undermined those noble aspirations of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Certainly for those of us who were written into this experiment that we call democracy, because we weren't included, because most of us didn't look like the founding fathers who wrote that document. We were not wealthy, white, male landowners. Right. And that's not an indictment against being wealthy or white or male, but it shows that the aspirations of this country that we're now a part of, we weren't reflected in the original document. So the teratogen, or the thing that what we understand in the birth process, teratogens are things, the Greek word teratos means monster. And so when it looked at birth outcomes that were hideous or that were strangely abnormal for what was expected in a normal human birth process, teratogens are those things that cause weird, strange outcomes. And so we look at things like racism, sexism, and patriarchy as teratogens to our national consciousness. The country that was conceived is not what we've ended up with, because those are the things that have declared themselves that have caused those things. If I look at our national consciousness, those things are birth defects of the country that we had conceptualized. And so in this moment, as during my 30-year career as someone where I delivered babies and you as a midwife, when the pregnancy ended up in an undetected severe birth defect, the question that the parents had of me, and I'm sure of you, was, what happened? Always. And I think in this moment, that's the question that we have about the country that we live in that should be inclusive, where I'm a citizen and you're a citizen, and yet in the original document, we had to be amended into the national consciousness. What happens that your womanhood is compromised and my race or my skin color is used against me?
So in some ways, I hear you saying that we're still in the process. It's been a really long labor. We're still in a very long labor, a process of trying to deliver this vision of freedom and justice for all. Justice comes before freedom, that we haven't delivered on the promises of that document, of those documents.
Right, and so when we look at that document, many people look at the Declaration of Independence as a birth certificate. And when we look at us having to be amended, we weren't included. So now, because we've not yet given birth to that society that was alluded to in the document, we probably have to look at the Declaration of Independence now more as a birth plan.
I love that. Yeah. I love that. Don't you love that? A birth plan, not a birth certificate, right? We're still in formation, still in gestation. We're still gestating.
Now, one of the tensions between midwives and obstetricians that has never existed between you and I, when we would often when we would show up in support of a pregnancy that hasn't gone according to plan, because when midwives and obstetricians work collaboratively for the best interest of the person giving birth, we used to say that one of the ways you make a pregnancy go awry is that you create a birth plan.
Oh.
Right?
Oh, really?
Right. That
Obstetricians say that?
Yeah. It was midwifery bashing, you know. We first stole obstetrics from you, and then we had to.
Thank you for acknowledging that.
We had to bash you after we stole it.
Yes.
No, that's kind of.
That's very patriarchal of you.
Yes, very, very American too. But the whole notion that we ended up. You asked me, the original question was, where are we in this moment? And I would say, if we use the birth analogy, where conception occurs and then birth results in the outcome that you want, if we look at the Declaration of Independence as a birth plan, and we look at a society that's anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-patriarchal, anti-misogynistic, anti-xenophobic, we are still gestating this newly conceived idea that a country like that can exist despite what we've ended up with based on our original document being the birth certificate versus a birth plan. If our original document is not a living document and we couldn't be amended into it so that we have constitutional rights, then maybe people are right that the country is exactly as it was designed to be. But if the Constitution is a living document, as I and many believe it to be, and that we sit here, I, the descendant of slaves, and you, the descendant of an immigrant, but also a white person and a woman who only next year will have had the right to vote for 100 years. 2 years from now, it will be 100 years. Then if we say that the Constitution is a birth plan, we, like Langston Hughes said, America is not America. America must be America, the America that has not yet been, but yet must be.
Yeah, it must be.
So we are now, I would argue, to continue this analogy, we both know analogies break down somewhere,
They do.
but right now I think we're still spot on. We are in a moment where we are pregnant with the possibility of the type of country that the document, the birth plan, amended says that we can be.
Right, imagine.
And so what that means is, in this, and I would say that the conception of what we can be, the conception that took would probably be when the Black Lives Matter movement was formulated now almost 10 years ago in response to black American citizens unarmed being killed by police. And the first police or wannabe policemen like Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and all of a sudden there was a rash, and when we started to pay attention, and then with the advent of technology, we're able to document and to see what, in my lived experience as a 57-year-old black man, what I've always heard is when I've heard of people being beaten or killed by police authority without provocation or cause, everybody can see it because of the media. So we are now with this point, in response to your question, in this moment where we are pregnant with the possibilities of the America that we long for, but it's not yet there.
Well, and I love this new framing of this point of conception for this new birth of a new freedom, starting in 2012 with the murder of Trayvon Martin, and then Michael Brown in 2014, and the birth of this Black Lives Matter movement, which I just read a headline. We read a headline this morning that said that the Black Lives Matter movement might be the largest movement ever in history of the United States of America, with 26 million citizens pouring out into the streets and protesting, which I think is a reflection of this also new consciousness that's birthing among us, and something that's been missing almost in the genetic makeup of the country up until now, right? When you exclude all Black people, when you exclude all women, you don't have the components that you need to create that dream. You know, we dream of what will be when we conceive, get pregnant, and have a child, but we haven't had the right combination of, egg and sperm, so to speak, until this moment, perhaps.
And if we argue that the conception with the three queer women of color, where a movement that was started that was decentralized, not masculine-centric, and yet was fully participatory by people from every walk of life.
Right.
If that is the conception, that movement has been building.
Yes.
And just like an early pregnancy, in an early gestation, and certainly in a first mom, the ability to feel the movement and to know that it is there, the first moment of quickening, as we call it, in pregnancy of the new mom is 20 weeks. But I would say the quickening moment for us with regard to the conception of this society that we can have in rejection of the society that we've had, the quickening moment was, in my opinion, when George Floyd was publicly murdered by a police officer on TV for documented. It was so graphic and so heinous and so callous, and it was captured in a way that nobody could look away. And so now, people with white skin who understand that that was a function of white privilege said that this is no longer acceptable, and then they began to speak out and to have as their own movement. America as it is, even though we love it, is not acceptable. And when we live so far beneath what we can be, it is not acceptable. And that's what the demand Black Lives Matter means, that all lives cannot matter until Black Lives Matter also. Not instead of or more than, but also.
Right, and I love this conversation, because naming that death and white America witnessing that death as a moment of quickening feels so powerful, because as a woman who's born children, I remember the power of that moment, like when you first feel the baby move inside you, and there's no turning back. Like you are just, it just takes over. And I remember how I felt. I remember how I felt the day I saw that video, and saying out loud, being in conversation with Pastor Smith and Reverend Marlin and others, Bishop Pearson, and saying, like, I've been changed. Like, there's no going back. This is different. This is something new. I know that's also painful to hear, because all those other deaths could have and should have been the beginning of this new birth. So I like it also in the context of this long, long labor and many births and being born and reborn again. But I think there's no going back. There is, just as with a pregnancy after that quickening, you're committed. A woman is committed.
In managing people's desires and expectations around reproduction, certainly the couple with infertility, when they've tried and they've had multiple failed attempts, when they conceive, all of the failed attempts, they forget. And so we will never forget the lives that have been lost up to this point that built the momentum. Each death, our effort to say her name and to not let that death be forgotten, it created a critical mass of consciousness that ultimately, when George Floyd was killed, we felt the thud as a society. And once the quickening has occurred, you can no longer deny or question whether or not you're pregnant. In this moment, we can no longer deny or question that the demand and the capacity and the demand to have a society that is founded in justice, that is anti-racist, that is anti-sexist and anti-patriarchal, that is anti-xenophobic. The possibility of that has been quickened in each of us, which puts us in this mysterious place of being both caretaker and birth attendant and pregnant person.
Right. I love.
Where we have to, the thing that we want to bring forth nationally and worldwide has to first be born in us. And in our relationships.
I know we've talked a lot about this relationship being a vehicle or a vessel, a container for new awakening and new awareness. And we wanted to offer that to people as an almost an example of all the conversations that can be happening.
Despite the 6 feet of distance that we are mandated to have in this moment of COVID, the spirit of kinship that we have that has grown and arisen across the boundaries of the social boundaries. I'm Black, you're white. I'm male, you're female. I'm born in this country, you're not.
Or I'm a midwife and you're an ObGyn. So
and those aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay, if you say so. But to that point, a midwife, it's so interesting because for me, being a midwife was an anti-patriarchal stance, right? It was a feminist claim about trusting the wisdom of women and the power of women. And it's also true that as a caretaker of natural birth, it was also my responsibility to pay attention to when birth was not proceeding normally. That's what I was trained to do, recognize when it was outside of the parameters of normal, when a pregnancy was not going well, when those teratogens you spoke about earlier were potentially harming the child or harming the mother or disturbing the natural birth process. So because the history of our country is so complicated, and this full birth of freedom has been so slow in coming, it's a good time to have an obstetrician gynecologist. Pay attention to those things, racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, because we have to treat those. We have to actively treat those if we want this birth to come to fruition.
Another insight that as we were talking about, we both know the inimical relationship that has existed between midwives and obstetricians, partially justifiably that obstetricians stole birth from midwives and then marginalized them. But in the same way, like captured Africans had their labor stolen and were kidnapped and brought to this country, and by people of European descent and white people, and yet we're both here. And where we are now, despite how we got here, our shared common interest is the well-being of this country and sharing and living in this space and turning it into a commonwealth. So just like you and I, even if we were trained differently and had a different focus in theory, in practice, what we both cared about was the well-being of the person we were taking care of. And so that's where what's demonstrated in this relationship and what this moment calls for, if we are going to gestate and deliver the promise of the anti-racist, anti-sexist society that we both aspire to see, is going to require working across the line of difference. The line of difference that's literal between black and white, just as literally we're black and white, but seeing each other beyond the differences that we can't change.
Yes, and seeing each other. I love this quote from Valerie Kaur, who just came out with this new book called See No Stranger, seeing each other as a part of ourselves that we don't know yet, which I just think is so powerful, right? To see you as a part of me, as a man, as a person with black skin, as an obstetrician, as a part of me, a part of the whole that I just don't know yet. And I love that because it also relates to my experience of being a pregnant person, right? That child is a part of me, but I don't really know that child until I give birth to the child and get to know the child. So it's almost like this nation that represents these exalted values is a part of us, not yet fully formed, and it's going to take all of us to birth it.
Right.
And to recognize it, right? We're all going to have to recognize it. It isn't what it's meant to be until we all, no matter who we are, no matter what we look like, no matter where we come from, can see it and recognize it as our own.
Ashe.
So the teratogens might be things that need to die. There's very much that awareness as a midwife that death is always present at a birth. I remember, and I think I'm speaking mostly to our white viewers when I talk about this. I think part of an obstacle to this birth of a new freedom that we're talking about is fear of losing what white people perceived they had before. And I remember when I was thinking about getting pregnant with my second child and when I was pregnant with my second, a really wise friend saying to me, because I was really worried. I loved my first daughter so much. I didn't want anything to change that. I didn't want her to feel less loved. And I remember a really wise friend saying, Barbara, instead of thinking about that something's going to be taken away from that relationship and that love that already exists, that you're going to bring somebody else into that circle of love. There'll be a gain for everybody. There's no limit on love. There's no limit on justice. There's no limit on freedom. There's no limit on what's possible, right, in human relationships. So it's going to be an expansion, not a loss. So I offer that, I think, as a way to help people who are struggling and maybe resisting the changes that they see around them.
In that same regard, when I think about where the fear comes from, particularly as people have to gain clarity about the difference between being white or having white skin and participating in white supremacy. White supremacy demands an absolute, complete, total possession of opportunity, and it requires the decimation or the devaluation of all things non-white. As people of color decolonize their minds and reject white supremacy, that starts with the beginning of self-love. And that self-love requires expression and declaration of self-love and identity. To someone who's had complete control of the narrative and whose identity has been predicated on the subordination of the dominated group. Black love or love of self by people of color can feel like hate of whiteness. And so I've seen a slogan that says, Black love does not equal white hate.
Like that.
So if you are fearful that people loving themselves and establishing themselves in their full humanity represents a loss for you, maybe you should try the fact that as people decolonize themselves, they're moving you out of a space that you were never entitled to in the first place.
And giving you more people to love. I mean, it's really true. I mean, right? It's once, I think of you as a person who speaks the truth, speaks from a place of deep wisdom. So, I mean, fear never drives out, what's that famous? Fear doesn't drive out hate, only love drives out hate. I mean, fear will only continue to separate us in the ways that we're different.
Right.
Whereas working through the differences and still discovering each other, knowing each other in our full humanity, only widens the circle of relationship, human relationship.
And that requires authentic relationship, because I think another thing with regard, when you say love, particularly in this moment where we've seen expressions of white supremacy and hate, and I'm thinking in particular about what happened in South Carolina, in Charleston, when a young white male filled with race hate went in and killed 9 black people in a church. And the national narrative and the demand in response to the horror was that the people who were victims, the black victims, the demand of the black community felt to me like the need to have black people forgive that transgression took precedent over the horror of what had happened. And so the demand for forgiveness in the absence of justice becomes an encroachment and an overreach. And we need to be clear about the difference between forgiveness and justice. Forgiveness is a personal decision between 2 people where one person's been wronged. But justice is our societal response and the rebalancing of the scales, not necessarily with a punitive action, but when we say that justice is about making literally true all lives matter, so that when you encroach upon any life, it becomes a violation of comparable severity. And so I think it becomes very important, particularly, and I think this is the real task of our faith leaders and for people who have a faith identity or even a deep humanist one, which is a form of a faith identity in my opinion, and that is that we have to make sure that people are clear about the difference between deep radical love and sentimentality, where loving actions and loving choices sometimes have to be done despite the lack of emotional attachment. It's hard to like somebody who's harming you. But a deep radical love says if you see the reciprocity and you see yourself in that other person, you always create the capacity for them to repent and to restore.
It's so this question of forgiveness is fascinating, and I've done some thinking about it just the last week, some in conversation with Pastor Smith. I was just listening to you and wondering why it would never occur to me to ask for forgiveness from a black person at this point in history because of the dramatic and drastic injustices still at work, at play. And I think it's partly because of one of my identities as a person of Jewish descent, and a famous story told in The Sunflower of a Nazi soldier after the war is over, dying in the hospital, asking a Jewish person in the hospital for forgiveness. And the Jewish man just being befuddled, struggling, wrestling with the question, and then saying, I can't offer that. It's not mine to offer. And it makes me think of what it was. If we have committed atrocities, or if we have been complicit in injustice, or if we have been collaborators in injustice, there's that internal birth work to do. That is each of us as an individual's work to do, to reshape and reform and atone and repent and make amends and really re-engage with the world with a new consciousness, a new sense of responsibility, a new sense of accountability. It's that transformation from an oblivious white person to an anti-racist white person.
Absolutely.
And we've talked some about why even the word ally or even accomplice feels not adequate, because I'm not in this fight only for justice and equal rights and equity and equality and the promise of a country that cares for all its people. I'm in this fight for my own humanity. I don't want to be part of a system that dehumanizes anybody, right?
Right.
So that's,
As
my fight.
It's absolutely. I bring that consciousness and awareness as a man who's doing work to overthrow patriarchy. And when I've been in spaces that are considered feminist spaces, when people confuse feminism with biology of being female, and therefore, if you're a feminist, you can only be a feminist if you're female, and if you're a man whose politics are feminist, you can only be an ally.
Right.
I struggle with the notion of calling Viola Liuzzo or Reverend James Reeb an ally when they gave their lives in pursuit of racial justice. It wasn't sentimental attachment. It wasn't doing penance for the group. It was the understanding that their humanity was contingent upon them rejecting white supremacy. Because I'm fully human as I sit here with black skin, right? And you as a white person cannot validate or invalidate my humanity. But if you want to participate in white supremacy, you have to, as a cost, devalue yourself and dehumanize yourself in order to be capable of dehumanizing behavior. So it really comes down to, in the question of considering ally or combatant, it's what front are you fighting on? I think what we're responding to is, especially on the issue of racial justice and racial justice work, there are white people who are more willing to lead the charge of black people against racism than to do the work in their own community. And so there's a unique scope of work for us all. I live in the context of being a black, heterosexual Christian man. There's a unique scope of work that I have to do that a white, Jewish, Universalist, Unitarian cannot do with black people.
Right, for sure.
Right? And so in the work that I do, when I do the work that's in my lane, when I stay in my lane, there's no traffic. So when I do the work that I'm called to do, I'm not being an ally, I'm being a justice worker, and you do the work. But if somebody calls me to lead the movement for white Jewish women, when I know what my lane is in my work, you don't have to put me in my place and say, be a good ally and stay in your lane, because when I am engaged in right thought, right speech, and right action, my constraints led by justice and equality and equity will tell me to stay in my lane, and will tell me, despite being flattered by their offer, that is not my role and not my place.
Right, and then with that mutual trust and respect, we can work in parallel.
We can get all the work done.
We can get all the work done. And I love that as a Christian man, you're drawing from that Buddhist tradition of right thought, right speech, and right action, which kind of goes along with that. We are all the birthing vessel. We are all the ones conceiving a new consciousness, of a new freedom, a new way of living together. And we are all the ones who are going to have to push. At different times, we will play all these different roles, right? We will be the birthing mother. We will be the new vision. We will be the midwife coaching. We will be the obstetrician. We will be the doula. And thank you, Celeste, for that beautiful meditation. And we'll be the obstetrician intervening, removing parts of this culture that don't work anymore, that don't serve the people. So we can each consider, reflect on what our part is to play.
If I could stay in our birth analogy, as a birth attendant, looking for the things that are negative affecting the outcome of a pregnancy antenatally or before birth, looking at the things that are positive, I would consider the prenatal vitamins, if you will, of anti-racist, anti-sexist society to be right thought, right speech, and right action. What do those look like? Right thought for me with regard to in the battle of injustice for any kind, Dr. King said that we should always be aware that we should work to defeat evil and corrupt systems, not the people caught up in them. So the infraction of white supremacy is not white skin. It's a white consciousness that demands absolute privilege and absolute entitlement at the expense of all the other people in the society. Right understanding means that in this moment, it's not about being anti-white. It's about being in opposition to white supremacy. We have to be clear that for non-white people, so what has to be clear to white people, as I said earlier, is that self-love is not about white hate. So there's no need to fear people no longer loathing themselves or no longer internalizing the devaluation that white supremacy requires in order to dominate. Absolutely.
Amen.
The pursuit of racial or any kind of justice is not simply the absence of tension. It's the presence of equity. Equity is different from equality. Equality says everybody's treated the same. Equity says according to your need. If we're at a baseball game and the fence is 5 feet high and you're 6 feet tall and I'm 4 feet tall, I need a 2-foot bench to stand on to see over the fence. You can't say I need a 2-foot bench too.
Won't work.
It's equity according to your need. So when we have equity, then equality can be possible. Then you can treat people the same when there's equity.
I love it. We just got the prescription from the physician for the new birth of freedom for the new America. We're going to have to write those up. Is there anything you haven't said that you want to say as we run out of time?
I would say as one last prenatal vitamin, right thought, right speech, right understanding leads to something that Lao Tzu said, which will lead to right conduct. Lao Tzu said that watch your thoughts because they become your words. Watch your words because they become your actions. Watch your actions because they become your habits. Watch your habits because they become your character. Watch your character because it becomes your destiny. Always pleasure.
Thank you.